Welcome. My name is Darrel Miller, and I work at Microsoft on APIs. For close to 30 years now, I've been trying to help developers be more successful at making network calls. For the last 8 years, I've been working with the Open API specifications team on being an editor of that specification. And about 6 years ago, I joined a team at Microsoft so that I could work on SDKs for the Microsoft Graph API. Microsoft Graph is it's the API for all the M365 data. So your emails, calendar, contacts, OneDrive, SharePoint, Teams messages. It's a pretty big API. So I've spent a significant amount of time talking and listening to developers about APIs and SDKs. And look, I know we're not supposed to talk about ourselves. The content is supposed to speak for ourselves, for itself. But I think today, more than ever, being able to make an informed decision about the credibility of a source of information is almost as important as the information itself. And I have opinions that I want to share with you. And now you have an idea as to where they come from. So, the one thing I've heard a lot of is complaints about SDKs. And I understand is a lot of pain around using SDKs to call APIs. Developers don't want to have to learn a new SDK every single time they go and try and use a new API. And it's frustrating when the SDK isn't available in your language, or it is, but it's out of date, or it's poorly implemented. Or maybe it works fine and it's up to date, but then you try and pull it into your application and there's a dependency that it uses. That's a different version of the dependency that's used within your own application. Is it really surprising that developers just end up like rolling their own code? And maybe you can handle writing good quality HTTP code, but can all of the devs on your team? I've seen some pretty bad code out there that really doesn't handle many of the edge cases. It doesn't do things efficiently when dealing with response request and response payloads. And sometimes they're just ticking time bombs for something that is going to fail when an exception occurs out in the wild. And really, is that what you want them doing? What you want them spending their time on? Writing HP boilerplate code and dealing with serialization and deserialization issues. So the question is, if there's so much pain around using SDKs, why do API producers create SDKs? Well, it's because we're developers and, this is a tabs versus space conversation, a YAML versus JSON. Where do the open curly braces go? Developers, we have opinions about things, and 50% of the developers will tell you, no, I'm not going to use your SDK. I know how to make HTTP calls. And the other 50% of developers will say, oh, yeah, I'm not using your API if you don't give me an SDK. I don't want to waste my time doing serialization, deserialization code. So API producers, they just don't have a choice. They're stuck. Instead of working on making that API better, they have to spend time producing boilerplate HTTP code in half a dozen different languages because they want great developer experience. It's key to API success. If you want to be the next Stripe or Twilio, you got to have great DevX. But reflecting on this, right? Do we really need a custom SDK for every single API? If you create a GraphQL API, you can use any GraphQL client. You don't need to create a specific SDK. It uses the API description, that GraphQL schema, to be able to know how to call a particular API. Or gRPC, you go grab the .proto file, use the standard gRPC tooling, and away you go. You can create yourself a stub. 20 years ago, we had this in SOAP. You could point a tooling to a WSDL endpoint, and it would go generate a client for you. Now, if somebody deployed an update to the API the next day, chances are that client wouldn't work anymore, but you mean that there were pros and cons. Ironically, HTTP API world is behind the curve on this, right? In the world of API descriptions. I mean, Swagger has been around for over 10 years now, But we spent a bunch of years arguing over what was the right API description to use. And it's taken a while for OpenAPI to become the de facto API description format. And we do have a variety of efforts now around SDK generators. For the longest time, they really were very unfunded efforts. But it's good. We're just starting to see some interest in really solving this problem of producing SDKs, which is expensive and painful to do. But the majority of the efforts today that I'm seeing are all focused on the API producer being the customer of this tooling. And in my opinion, we've been building for the wrong customer. It should be the API consumers who can choose their own tooling for generating client code for an HTTP API. They should only have to learn that single tool to be able to get a consistent experience across their APIs. No matter which API they're using, they should be able to get the same kind of API surface. API consumers shouldn't have to depend on waiting for API producers to produce an SDK in order to be able to get a great experience with the API that they want to call. According to the Postman 2023 survey, only about 15% of APIs are actually public. How many internal APIs do you think actually have SDKs produced for them? Probably very few. Imagine if we could get high quality DevX for internal APIs as well as external. This was the realization my team came to when we were building yet another API generator for our own Microsoft Graph APIs. We were paying off technical debt from an old SDK generator that was just very painful to work with and was really slowing us down. And we decided to stop building a tool where we were the primary customer. And we built a tool that our customers could use to create their own client code for our API. Now, the tool still works for building SDKs, and we use it for that, but it's a business that we want to get out of. We believe that we can build a better experience for our customers by enabling them to self-serve. But that's not a change that can happen overnight. So yeah, we built a tool for you, the API consumer. It's fast. There's a command line. There's a VS Code extension for a UI experience. There's a Docker container. Thousands of developers have downloaded the extension. The command line tool has been downloaded hundreds of thousands of times. We use it for our own internal APIs. We use it for external APIs. Other large enterprises like GitHub, they use it. Red Hat use it. Now, admittedly, they use it to build packaged SDKs, but their customers can have the option of doing self-serve against their APIs too. This isn't some side project. This isn't Microsoft doing source open where we build something and then just say, hey, you can look at our source code. This is an open source project. We've had many external contributions. Red Hat have been a significant influence on our Java implementation. And we currently support about 7 languages and have experimental support for 2 others. We have community efforts around at the moment looking at languages like Rust and Dart. So it is a real thing for you to go and try. But we do have opinions. It is a tooling that is very opinionated about the shape of the API surface that it generates. We reflect HTTP concepts into your programming language. We make no effort to hide the fact that we're making HTTP calls. We want you to wrap our generated code with an interface that maps the use case, matches the use case and the style that your application and your team work in. You're going to need that interface anyway in order to be able to mock the API. So why not build that interface to separate it, create that separation of concerns? You don't want our generated code deeply intertwined with your application code anyway. And it's interesting. We've had a lot of customers that, yes, we really like this tool. It's great, but I just don't like uh, the way it does such and such thing. Can we have a setting so that it generates a slightly different style of experience? But we're not in the business of enabling API producers to create beautifully crafted experiences for their specific API. We are in the business of creating a consistent experience for an API consumer, no matter what API they are using. And we care deeply about producing code that's resilient, reliable, and performant. And that's really difficult to achieve when you've got hundreds of knobs and switches and templates where you created yourself so many different code paths in order to achieve the same thing, but this slightly different style of doing things. Now, if you don't like our style, that we generate, I completely get it. We can still be friends, right? You've got options. You can take our code and you hide it behind an interface. This is what we want you to do, right? And hide it behind an interface and forget it exists. You won't have to spend a whole lot of time looking at it. It's really easy to write that adapter code. And after doing it 2 or 3 times, generative AI like GitHub Copilot ends up generating most of that code for you anyway. And so you can, create it and forget it until you need to create another adapter. If that doesn't work for you, fine. Fork the project. It's open source, right? We have a pipeline where we pull in the OpenAPI description, we deserialize it, we build it into a code model, and then we have language refiners and language writers. Create your own refiners and writers to build your own style. That's perfectly valid. Or just don't use the tool at all, right? Use a different generator. Well, go build your own, but build it for API consumers. I'm not here to sell you on a product. I'm here to sell you on an idea. If we really want to get the most out of HTTP, we need to really stop rewriting all of the basic plumbing again and again for every API. Okay, why don't we see bidirectional streaming HTTP APIs that are ubiquitous? gRPC does it over HTTP too. Why don't we have client-side connection load balancing? gRPC clients have that built in. Most HTTP API clients don't. Why don't we just have why can't we just flip a switch in order to enable request signing? Why can't we use binary payloads like Avro and Message Pack and Cbor and Protobuf over our HTTP APIs? Why is that option just not a client configuration option? Pull in a new serializer and away you go. The problem is API producers are so busy generating, packaging, shipping, and supporting SDKs in 7 different languages to have time to really move us forward. One of the things that we discovered on this journey to move towards focusing on the API consumer is that API client code and the generation of it is really only one piece of the puzzle. Before a developer can generate client code, they need to go find the OpenAPI description. We don't have NPM or Maven or PyPy or NuGet for OpenAPI descriptions. I keep trying to make it happen, but I've failed so far. And I'm really happy that folks like Ken Lane and Steve Wilmot have re-energized the effort around APIs.json. We use APIs.json. If you put it in a GitHub repo, we can search, because we have search as a first-class capability. You can put it in a GitHub repo, either public or private GitHub repo, and we will go find those API descriptions. There's a lot more work to do in the search space, but it is an absolutely core requirement of this experience of making a rich API consumption experience. Selection is the next big fundamental capability. No matter how big or small an API is, most consumers do not call every single operation. In our tooling, we ask the consumer to select the operations that they want to call, and then we generate the code just for those operations. And that has a really interesting side effect. We generate what we call an API manifest that identifies those API operations that have been selected and that your application can actually call. Think of it kind of like a packages.json, but for API dependencies. And this has the potential to enable an entire ecosystem of capabilities. Think of Dependabot for API changes. You have a dependency on this operation and this API over here, and they released a new version or an update to it that has a new query parameter or a new property in the response payload. It'd be nice to be able to get a notification to know that, hey, if we regenerate that client code, you'll be able to take advantage of those new features. What about security vulnerability reporting? Do you know for your applications what APIs they actually have dependencies on without actually going and reading the source code? This starts to get into the world of software bill of materials and secure supply chains. Speaking of secure supply chains, if your service integrates with a dozen different APIs, how do your security people feel about taking dependencies on libraries from a dozen different API producers? Your supply chain for the code that's running on your service just got a whole lot bigger. If you use a single tool to generate the client code to consume all the APIs that you have dependencies on, you've only got one software provider to be concerned about. Now, generate obviously is a core capability, but developers need to be able to run immediately after generating. This needs to be an inner dev loop type of activity. It needs to be, I'm working in the code, I'm trying to solve a problem. I think there's an API that allows me to do this. Let me go look in the API that I have a dependency on. Yes, I also want to take a dependency on this thing. Select it, generate the code. Immediately, it's there for my autocomplete, and I can start working on it. It needs to be a 30-second activity to go and incrementally add new operations. And this is the type of capability that just does not get considered when we build SDK generators for API producers. And this is why we need to refocus our efforts on API consumers. So my call to action to you is go find the open API descriptions for the APIs that you consume. Go try our tool. We call it Kyoto. Should be easy to find. There's lots of sample demo videos out there. I've shared a couple of links here. If you don't like it, fine. Find another tool you like, but start generating your own client code. API producers have more important work that they need to go do. We, as API consumers, need to up our game and leverage open API to build better tooling that will work for any HTTP API. Thank you for your time. Thank you for listening.